You've been stuck for months, maybe years. Not in a dramatic way. No major crisis, no clear breaking point. Just stuck. Stuck in a job that drains you. Stuck in a marriage that feels more like cohabitation than connection. Stuck in a version of yourself that no longer fits, but that you don't know how to shed. You've tried to fix it. You've read the books, listened to the podcast, made the plans. You've told yourself you just need more discipline, more motivation, more clarity. But nothing changes, and the longer you stay stuck, the more isolated you become. Because who wants to hear about your problems? Who has time for your confusion when everyone else seems to have their life figured out? So you stop talking about it. You stop reaching out. You convince yourself that this is just how midlife feels. Heavy, uncertain, alone. But here's what you don't realize. The thing keeping you stuck isn't a lack of willpower or insight. It's isolation itself. And the solution isn't another self-help strategy. It's something you've probably dismissed as irrelevant or unnecessary. Something that feels uncomfortable, even embarrassing. Support groups, not therapy, not life coaching, just a room full of strangers who are stuck too. And it might be the most powerful thing you never considered. Here's the paradox. You've spent your entire adult life being independent. You've prided yourself on handling your own problems, not burdening others, figuring things out on your own. Self-reliance has been your strength. The ability to show up, solve problems, and keep moving forward without needing constant validation or support. That's what made you successful. That's what got you through your 20s and 30s. That's what allowed you to build a career, raise a family, survive setbacks without falling apart. But now, in midlife, that same independence is what's keeping you stuck. Because the problems you're facing now aren't the kind you can solve alone. They're not technical problems with clear solutions. They're existential problems, identity problems, meaning problems. And those don't get solved by thinking harder or trying more strategies. They get solved by being witnessed, by being seen in your struggle by people who understand what it feels like to be stuck in the same place. But admitting you need support feels like failure. It feels like weakness. You look at support groups, grief groups, divorce recovery groups, midlife transition groups, and you think, that's not for me. That's for people who can't handle things on their own. That's for people who are really broken. You're not that bad. You're functional. You're still showing up to work, still paying your bills, still keeping your life together on the surface. So why would you sit in a circle with strangers and talk about your feelings? What could they possibly offer that you haven't already tried? And more than that, what if they judge you? What if your problems sound trivial compared to theirs? What if you don't belong there either? So you stay isolated. You keep your struggles private. You tell yourself you'll reach out when things get really bad, but they never get bad enough to justify it because you're still functioning. You're still managing. And as long as you're managing, you don't need help, except you do. Because managing isn't the same as living, and being functional isn't the same as being okay. You're stuck in a kind of silent suffering that doesn't look dramatic from the outside, but feels suffocating from the inside. And the longer you stay in it alone, the more normal it starts to feel. You forget what it's like to feel connected. You forget what it's like to be honest about how hard things are. You forget that other people are struggling too, because everyone else is performing competence just like you are. And here's the cruelest part of the paradox. The very thing that could help you feel less stuck, connection, vulnerability, shared experience, is the thing that feels most impossible when you're stuck. Because being stuck makes you feel like you have nothing to offer, like you're boring, like your pain isn't interesting or valid enough to take up space in someone else's life. So you withdraw. You stop reaching out. You tell yourself you'll reconnect when you have something positive to share, when you've figured things out, when you're on the other side. But you never get to the other side because isolation is what keeps you stuck. It's a feedback loop. The more isolated you are, the more stuck you feel. The more stuck you feel, the more you isolate, and eventually you convince yourself that this is just who you are now. Someone who doesn't need people, someone who handles things alone, someone who's fine, but you're not fine. And the reason support groups work, the reason they have unexpected power, is because they break that loop. Not by solving your problems, not by giving you answers, but by reminding you that you're not alone in being stuck, that other people feel exactly the way you do, that your confusion, your exhaustion, your sense of being trapped in a life that no longer makes sense, it's not a personal failure. It's a shared human experience, and that changes everything. Because once you realize you're not uniquely broken, you stop needing to hide. And once you stop hiding, you start moving again. Not because someone fixed you, but because you remembered what it feels like to be seen. The unexpected power of support groups when you're feeling stuck begins with understanding what they actually are. They're not therapy, though they can be therapeutic. They're not networking, though connections form. They're not problem-solving sessions, though insights emerge. Support groups are simply spaces where people who share a common struggle come together to be honest about it. No performance, no fixing, no need to have answers. Just the radical act of showing up and saying, "This is hard for me too." And that simplicity is exactly what makes them powerful. Because when you're stuck, you don't need more advice. You need permission to stop pretending you're fine. Most people resist support groups because they've misunderstood what vulnerability means. They think vulnerability is oversharing, dumping emotions on strangers, or performing brokenness for sympathy. But real vulnerability isn't dramatic. It's quiet. It's saying, "I don't know what to do next," and not rushing to fill the silence with false certainty. It's admitting that you're lonely without making it a crisis. It's acknowledging that you're scared without needing someone to tell you it'll be okay. Support groups work because they create space for that kind of honesty, not once in a moment of breakdown, but regularly, week after week, until honesty stops feeling like exposure and starts feeling like relief. When you walk into your first support group, you'll probably feel uncomfortable. You'll scan the room and wonder if you belong. You'll listen to other people's stories and compare them to yours, trying to determine if your pain is valid enough to be there. You might feel like an imposter, like you're not struggling enough to justify taking up space. Or you might feel like you're too far gone, too stuck, too broken for a group like this to help. Both feelings are normal. Both are lies your isolation has been telling you. Because the truth is, there's no hierarchy of suffering. There's no threshold you have to meet. If you're stuck, you belong. If you're struggling, you have a place there. And the moment you stop judging your right to be in the room is the moment the group starts working. What happens in support groups isn't magic. It's recognition. Someone describes feeling invisible in their own life, and you realize you feel that way too. Someone talks about the exhaustion of pretending everything is fine, and you recognize the weight you've been carrying. Someone admits they don't know who they are anymore, and you hear your own voice in theirs. This is the power of mirroring, seeing your internal experience reflected in another person's words. It doesn't solve anything, but it dissolves the shame, because shame thrives in isolation. It tells you that you're uniquely flawed, that everyone else has it together, that your struggle is evidence of your inadequacy. But when you sit in a room with people who feel exactly the way you do, shame loses its grip. You realize that being stuck isn't a character flaw, it's a human experience. And here's what most people don't expect. Support groups don't just validate your pain, they challenge your story about it. Because when you've been stuck for a long time, you develop narratives to explain why. You tell yourself you're stuck because you made bad choices, because you're not strong enough, because life is unfair, because it's too late to change. These stories feel true because you've repeated them so many times. But in a support group, you hear other people tell similar stories, and from the outside, you can see how limiting they are. You can see how someone is keeping themselves stuck by believing they're too old to start over. And in seeing that, you start to recognize the ways your own stories are keeping you trapped. Not because anyone lectures you, but because witnessing others gives you perspective on yourself. Support groups also do something you can't do alone. They break the illusion of terminal uniqueness. That's the belief that your situation is so specific, so complicated, so unprecedented that no one could possibly understand. It's the voice that says, "You don't get it. My marriage is different. My job is different. My regrets are different. And maybe the details are different. But the emotional territory is the same. The feeling of being trapped. The fear of making the wrong choice. The grief of losing a version of yourself you'll never get back." When you hear someone describe those feelings in their own words, you realize that your pain isn't as isolating as you thought. And that realization is what allows connection to happen. Not because you're all the same, but because you're all human. One of the most underestimated aspects of support groups is routine. Showing up at the same time, to the same place, with the same people, creates structure when your life feels chaotic. It becomes an anchor, a commitment that doesn't depend on how you feel that day. You don't have to want to go. You don't have to feel like talking. You just have to show up. And over time, that consistency becomes its own form of resilience. Because when you're stuck, motivation is unreliable. You can't wait until you feel like reaching out. You need a structure that holds you even when you don't have the energy to hold yourself. Support groups provide that. They say, you don't have to have it together to be here. You just have to be here. Another unexpected benefit is accountability without judgment. When you tell a therapist or a friend that you're going to make a change, there's often pressure to follow through. But in a support group, accountability works differently. You share what you're struggling with, and the group witnesses it. No one tells you what to do. No one checks up on you to make sure you did it. But the next week, when you come back, you have the opportunity to report honestly about what happened. Did you take a step? Did you stay stuck? Either way, the group holds space for it. That kind of gentle, non-coercive accountability can be more powerful than advice because it reminds you that you're responsible for your own life, but you don't have to carry that responsibility in isolation. Support groups also teach you how to listen, not to respond, not to fix, not to relate everything back to your own experience, but to truly hear another person's pain without needing to do anything with it. This is harder than it sounds. Most of us have been trained to offer solutions, to reassure, to make discomfort go away as quickly as possible. But in a support group, you learn to sit with someone's pain and just let it exist. And that skill, the ability to be present without fixing, changes the way you relate to your own pain too. You stop needing to immediately solve everything. You stop treating every difficult emotion as a problem to eliminate. You start allowing yourself to feel stuck without rushing to unstick yourself. And paradoxically, that's when movement becomes possible. Over time, something else happens. You start to see people change, not in dramatic, overnight transformations, but in small, incremental shifts. Someone who couldn't stop crying in their first session eventually shares a moment of peace. Someone who was paralyzed by indecision takes a small step forward. Someone who felt completely isolated starts reaching out to others in the group. And witnessing those changes, not in yourself, but in others, gives you hope. Not the false hope of easy answers, but the grounded hope that change is possible even when it feels impossible, that people do get unstuck, that life does move forward even when it feels permanently frozen. And perhaps most importantly, support groups remind you that you have something to offer. When you're stuck, you feel useless, like you're taking up space without contributing anything valuable. But in a support group, your presence matters. Your story matters. The fact that you showed up even when it was hard matters to someone else who's struggling to show up too. You don't have to be healed to help. You don't have to have answers to be valuable. Just being there, being honest, being willing to sit in discomfort alongside others, that's enough. And realizing that you're not just receiving support, but offering it too, that shifts your entire sense of self. You stop seeing yourself as broken and start seeing yourself as part of a community. And that's when being stuck stops feeling like a life sentence and starts feeling like a temporary season. When you finally stop isolating and start showing up to a support group, the first thing that changes is the weight you've been carrying. Not because anyone takes it from you, but because you're no longer carrying it alone. You realize that the exhaustion you felt isn't just from the problem itself. It's from the secrecy, from pretending you're fine, from performing competence while barely holding yourself together. When you sit in a room with people who understand, you can finally put that performance down. You don't have to explain yourself. You don't have to justify your pain. You can just be tired, just be confused, just be stuck. And that permission to stop pretending is itself a form of healing. You also start to see yourself more clearly. When you're isolated, your thoughts become an echo chamber. The same fears, the same doubts, the same stories loop endlessly without interruption. But in a support group, you hear your thoughts reflected back to you through other people's experiences. And sometimes, hearing someone else articulate what you've been feeling helps you understand it better. Other times, you hear someone describe a belief you also hold, and from the outside, you can see how distorted it is, how they're being too hard on themselves, how they're letting fear make decisions for them, And in recognizing that in someone else, you start to recognize it in yourself, not because anyone pointed it out, but because perspective only works when you step outside your own head. Your relationship with vulnerability transforms. What once felt like weakness starts to feel like courage. Because it takes more strength to walk into a room full of strangers and say, "I'm struggling," than it does to keep suffering in silence. You realize that the people you respect most in the group aren't the ones who have it all figured out. They're the ones who are honest about not having it figured out. The ones who show up even when they don't want to. The ones who admit they're scared, they're lonely, they're stuck, and keep showing up anyway. And slowly, you start to see that same courage in yourself. Not because you've changed overnight, but because you're practicing vulnerability every single week, and practice builds skill. Connection stops feeling optional and starts feeling essential. For years, maybe decades, you've told yourself that you don't need people, that you're fine on your own, that relationships are nice to have but not necessary. But sitting in a support group, you realize how much you've been starving for real connection, not surface level small talk, not transactional friendships, but the kind of connection where you can say hard things and not be met with advice or judgment. Just presence, just understanding. And once you experience that, you can't go back to pretending isolation is strength. You start reaching out more. Not just in the group, but in the rest of your life. You text a friend you've been avoiding. You have an honest conversation instead of deflecting. You let people see you, even when it's uncomfortable, because you've learned that being seen doesn't destroy you. It sustains you. You also discover that your pain has purpose, not in some cosmic, everything happens for a reason way, but in the simple fact that your struggle, honestly shared, helps someone else feel less alone. You watch someone new walk into the group looking terrified, and you remember what that felt like. You share your story, not because you've overcome it, but because you're still in it. And afterward, that person tells you, "Thank you. I thought I was the only one who felt that way." And in that moment, you realize that your mess isn't just something to fix or hide. It's something that connects you to other people. It's proof that you're human, that you're real, that you matter, not in spite of your struggles, but because of them. Over time, you start to move again. Not because the group solved your problems, but because you stopped believing you had to solve them alone. You take a small risk you wouldn't have taken before. You make a decision you've been avoiding. You try something new even though you're scared. And when it doesn't go perfectly, you don't collapse. Because you know you have somewhere to go with the disappointment, somewhere to process it, somewhere to be honest about how hard it still is. And that safety net, knowing you don't have to face failure alone, is what makes risk possible. You stop waiting for certainty before you act. You stop needing guarantees. You start experimenting with your life again, trying things, failing, adjusting, trying again. Not because you suddenly became brave, but because you're no longer paralyzed by the fear of failing alone. And perhaps, most surprisingly, you start to enjoy showing up. What felt uncomfortable at first becomes something you look forward to. Not because your life is better, but because for 1 hour a week, you get to be completely honest. You get to be yourself without apology. You get to sit with people who see you really see you, and don't look away. And that experience, repeated over time, changes how you see yourself. You stop defining yourself by how stuck you are and start recognizing yourself as someone who's willing to keep showing up, someone who's still trying, someone who matters. You don't have to stay stuck, and you don't have to unstick yourself alone. That's the lie isolation tells you, that needing help means you've failed, that asking for support is weakness, that you should be able to figure this out on your own. But the truth is, some kinds of stuck can only be undone through connection, not because other people have your answers, but because they remind you that you're not uniquely broken. That feeling lost in midlife isn't a personal failure. That struggling doesn't mean you're doing life wrong. It means you're human. And humans weren't designed to suffer in isolation. Support groups won't fix everything. They won't give you a new career, repair your marriage, or erase your regrets. But they'll give you something more important, a place to be honest, a place to stop performing, a place to remember that you're not alone, even when it feels like you are. And that matters more than you think. Because being stuck isn't just about circumstances. It's about the story you tell yourself about those circumstances. And when you're alone, that story becomes gospel. But when you're with others, it becomes just one version, one perspective, one possibility among many. So if you're stuck, truly stuck, consider the thing you've been dismissing. Find a group. Show up. Be uncomfortable. Be honest. Let yourself be witnessed by people who understand. You don't have to have it together. You don't have to know what to say. You just have to be willing to stop carrying everything alone. Because the unexpected power of support groups isn't that they unstick you. It's that they remind you that being stuck isn't the end. It's just a place you're passing through, and you don't have to pass through it alone. You never did.